The bitter wind howls outside the longhouse, finding every crack in the timber walls, every gap in the thatch. Inside, the air hangs heavy with wood smoke that stings the eyes and coats the lungs. A single fire pit in the centre of the earthen floor provides the only warmth and light, casting long shadows across the faces of those huddled around it. A woman lies on a bed of straw, her body racked with pain, her face slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. The midwife, an old woman with hands gnarled like ancient oak roots, kneels between her legs, murmuring prayers to Frigg, goddess of motherhood. "Push," she commands. "Push now." The mother's scream pierces the night as new life enters the world. A tiny, blue-tinged infant, slick with blood and birth fluids. The midwife works quickly, cutting the cord with an iron knife, rubbing the child vigorously with rough linen cloth. For several heart-stopping moments, the baby makes no sound. The father, standing in the shadows, grips his axe handle until his knuckles whiten. Then, finally, a weak cry breaks the tension. But this is no moment of pure joy. This is the Viking Age, and this child, born in the dead of winter, when food stores run low and sickness stalks every settlement, faces odds that would terrify modern parents. A few feet away, the mother's other children continue their work by firelight. A girl of 7 stirs a pot of thin gruel, her small hands already calloused from daily labour. A boy of 10 whittles a piece of wood, fashioning a crude knife that he'll soon need to use for real tasks. Neither looks up at their new siblings' cries. They've seen babies born before. They've also seen them die. What was it like to be born into this world? To open your eyes for the first time in a smoky longhouse, with the howl of wolves in the distance, and the creak of a warrior's shield hanging on the wall? What would your chances have been had you drawn your first breath in a land where summer's bounty was always shadowed by winter's deadly promise? Imagine yourself as that newborn. Your first test begins immediately. Will your lungs fill properly with air? Will your tiny body generate enough heat to survive the night? Will your mother have enough milk to feed you? Or will hunger begin its relentless assault on your developing body from day one? The Vikings, those seafaring Norse people who raided, traded and settled throughout Europe from the late 8th to late 11th centuries, are often remembered for their adult exploits, their fearsome longships appearing on the horizon, their axes and swords dealing death, their bold explorations reaching as far as North America. But every Viking warrior, every shield maiden, every craftsman and farmer once began as a vulnerable infant, fighting for survival from their very first breath. Archaeological evidence from sites across Scandinavia tells a sobering tale. At burial grounds in places like Birka in Sweden and Lindholm Høje in Denmark, the small skeletons of children are found in disturbing numbers. Modern forensic analysis reveals stories of malnutrition, disease and injury etched into these ancient bones. These children lived brief, harsh lives that would be unrecognisable to most youngsters today. Would you have survived a Viking childhood? Would your body have withstood the diseases that ravaged settlements? Would your spirit have endured the early responsibilities, the harsh training, the expectations of a culture that valued strength above all else? Would you have lived long enough to take your place on a raid, to swing an axe in battle, to see your own children born into this unforgiving world? This is the story of childhood in the Viking Age, a time when children were simultaneously valued as the future of their family line and treated as small adults with responsibilities that would crush many modern grown-ups. It's a tale of incredible resilience, of cultural practices, both brutal and tender, of children who played with toy wooden swords one day and wielded real ones the next. What does it mean to grow up in a society where death is an everyday companion? Where is your value measured by your contribution to survival? Where do the gods themselves demand strength and courage, even from the youngest members of society? Let's step back in time, into the smoky longhouses and windswept farmsteads of the Viking world, to witness childhood at its most challenging, and perhaps in some surprising ways, at its most formative. Born into a harsh world, The moment of birth in Viking society was not merely the beginning of life, it was the first battle in a war for survival. Archaeological excavations at major Viking settlements like Birka in Sweden, Kaupang in Norway, and Ribe in Denmark have yielded grim evidence of this reality. Infant burial sites, sometimes containing multiple newborns, telling silent stories of lives barely begun before being extinguished. At Birka, the great trading centre on Lake Mälaren, archaeologists have uncovered infant remains buried beneath house floors, a common practice that kept the deceased child close to the family. Analysis of these tiny skeletons reveals that many died within days or weeks of birth, their bones showing no signs of injury or disease, simply the failure to thrive in a harsh environment. The clustering of infant burials in certain areas suggests periods of famine or disease that swept through communities, claiming the youngest and most vulnerable first. A particularly haunting find from Kaupang shows the remains of a newborn, carefully wrapped in a woolen cloth, placed in a small wooden box with a single amber bead, a luxury item that speaks to the parents' grief and desire to provide something precious for their child's journey to the afterlife. Despite the Vikings' reputation for stoicism, such burial goods demonstrate that the loss of an infant was felt deeply, a wound to both the heart and to the family's hopes for the future. The timing of birth could determine a child's fate before they drew their first breath. Winter births were particularly perilous. As the sagas tell us, born in the heart of winter, when even the gods huddle close to their fires, such children face immediate challenges that summer babies might avoid. Consider the practical realities. A winter birth meant the mother had been pregnant through the harvest season, labouring heavily when her body needed nutrition most. It meant the newborn arrived when food stores were dwindling, when hunting was difficult, when the nutritional quality of a mother's milk might be compromised by her own hunger. It meant a tiny body struggling to maintain warmth in a longhouse, where temperatures dropped drastically away from the central hearth. The Gokstad ship burial in Norway, dating to around 900 CE, contained the remains of a wealthy chieftain, but nearby were found the bodies of several infants, all appearing to have died during the same winter period, suggesting a devastating season that spared neither rich nor poor. Their tiny bones tell a story of vitamin D deficiency, the result of insufficient sunlight during the long northern winters combined with inadequate diet. The controversial practice of infanticide has been debated among historians studying Viking culture. The written sources, primarily composed after Christianization, condemn the practice while acknowledging its existence. The Gulathinglaw, one of Norway's oldest legal codes, specifically forbids bearing children out to die, a prohibition that would be unnecessary if the practice didn't occur. But was infanticide common, or a desperate last resort? The archaeological evidence suggests nuance. At some sites, infants were found buried with care and grave goods, while at others remains were discovered in middens or peripheral areas, suggesting different circumstances of death and different attitudes toward the deceased. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who encountered Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, wrote that they valued strong children, but showed little remorse at abandoning the weak, an outsider's perspective that may contain truth but also cultural misunderstanding. What's certain is that practical necessity often trumped sentiment. A child born with visible deformities, or who failed to thrive, might be seen as an unsustainable burden in a subsistence economy, where every member needed to contribute. The Old Norse term utbyrda referred to the exposure of unwanted infants, a practice that, while difficult for modern sensibilities to accept, was viewed through a different moral lens in a society where survival of the family group took precedence. Yet even here, evidence suggests complexity rather than callousness. Excavations at Hofstadr in Iceland revealed the remains of a child born with a cleft palate who survived into early childhood, proof that some families chose to nurture even those children who would have required significant extra care. The rituals surrounding birth reveal much about Viking values and beliefs. Before Christianity took hold in Scandinavia, the naming ceremony, the Aosa Vatni, or water sprinkling, marked a child's formal acceptance into the family. Until this ceremony was performed, some scholars suggest the child existed in a liminal state where exposure would not be considered murder. During this pagan ceremony, the father would formally recognise the infant as his own, bestowing a name that often honoured ancestors or desired qualities. Water would be sprinkled over the child, a practice that later facilitated the transition to Christian baptism. And the infant would receive its first gift, often an amulet of Thor's hammer for protection, or a small ring, the first piece of wealth in a society where personal treasure defined one's standing. The Archaeological saga describes such a naming ceremony. Thorstein took his son and had water sprinkled over him and gave him the name Grim after his father's father. This simple act transformed the infant from a potential outsider to a recognised member of the family line, with all the protection that entailed. Contrast this with the Christian rituals that gradually replaced pagan practices as Scandinavia converted. Baptism, performed by a priest rather than the father, transferred spiritual authority from the family to the church. The Kristni saga and other conversion-era texts describe the tension between these competing worldviews, with some families hedging their bets by performing both ceremonies. The archaeological record from the conversion period, roughly 900 to 1100 CE, shows this duality. At Zebersund in Denmark, infant burials from this transitional time contain both Thor's hammers and Christian crosses, parents unwilling to abandon old protections even as they embraced the new faith. What did these competing spiritual frameworks mean for a newborn Viking? Under paganism, a child's worth was tied directly to family recognition and potential contribution. Under Christianity, each infant possessed an immortal soul requiring salvation. This shift gradually, though never completely, changed attitudes toward infanticide and child-rearing practices. The mother's role in childbirth was both central and perilous. The Eddic poem Sigurdrifumal references help runes that should be carved to assist women in childbirth, evidence that magical protection was deemed necessary for this dangerous passage. Excavations have uncovered small amulets depicting Frigg or Freya, goddesses associated with childbirth, clutched in the hands of women who died in labour, their bodies buried alongside their unborn or newborn children. At Fyrkat in Denmark, a woman's grave contained a staff associated with Völur, female practitioners of cedar magic, suggesting her role as a midwife with spiritual powers. Such women commanded respect but also fear, wielding influence at the critical threshold between life and death. For the mother who survived childbirth, physical recovery was brief by modern standards. The sagas mention women up and working within days of giving birth, necessity trumping physical well-being. A famous passage from Gisla Saga describes a woman giving birth during a battle, pausing only briefly before rejoining the fight. An idealised account, certainly, but one that reflects cultural expectations of female endurance. The newborn, having survived birth itself, faced immediate challenges. Colostrum, the first milk rich in antibodies, provided crucial protection against disease, but only if the mother produced enough and understood its value. Some archaeological evidence suggests the use of animal horn bottles for feeding infants, particularly in wealthy households where wet nurses might be employed, or in cases where the mother died in childbirth. The swaddling of infants, wrapping them tightly in woolen bands, served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, it helped maintain body temperature and required less constant supervision. Symbolically, it represented the binding of the child to the family and community, a physical manifestation of social incorporation. What would you have experienced in those first days of life in the Viking world? The smoke-filled air of the longhouse, the rough texture of woolen swaddling against your skin, the voices of siblings and parents mixing with the sounds of animals often kept in the same structure during winter. Your tiny body would process your mother's milk whose quality depended entirely on her nutrition, which in turn reflected the family status and the season's bounty. Would you have been among the fortunate ones, born to a wealthy family in summer's abundance? Or would you have drawn your first breath in a thrall's quarters during the hunger months, when even free farmers struggled to feed their families? Your social station, determined at birth, would shape every aspect of your young life. If you survived long enough to experience it, what thoughts went through a Viking mother's mind as she nursed her newborn through those precarious first weeks? The sagas, for all their detail about battles and honour, rarely give us these intimate moments. But occasional glimpses emerge. A verse attributed to a mother in Egil's saga, speaking to her infant. Dark-eyed, hawk-keen, wolf-fierce you seem, you shall live to make men tremble. Hope and expectation, fear and determination, all bound together in the act of nurturing new life against overwhelming odds. For those who survived the perilous passage of birth and early infancy, a new set of challenges awaited. Diseases and conditions that would test even the strongest constitution, culling the weak and leaving only the most resilient to grow into Viking adulthood. Childhood diseases and mortality. The bones tell stories that words cannot. Across Viking archaeological sites from Dublin to Novgorod, the small skeletons of children reveal patterns of disease, malnutrition, and injury that paint a stark picture of early life in the Norse world. These silent testimonies, etched in calcium and collagen, speak of suffering that modern children in developed nations will never know. At Westness Cemetery on Rusay, Orkney, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a child approximately 6 years old. The bones show clear signs of rickets, the bowing of leg bones, and malformation of the ribcage caused by vitamin D deficiency. This child lived through several winters of insufficient sunlight and inadequate diet before succumbing, likely to a respiratory infection made worse by their weakened condition. Similar evidence appears at sites throughout the Viking world, particularly in northern settlements where winter sunlight is scarce. The prevalence of rickets speaks to a fundamental challenge of raising children in northern latitudes, balancing the need for shelter against the body's requirement for sunlight. Children kept indoors during harsh winters survived immediate threats like frostbite and exposure, but developed chronic conditions that weaken them against future challenges. Those sent outdoors for sufficient periods might avoid rickets, but risked cold-related injuries and illnesses. Linear enamel hyperplasia, visible lines in tooth enamel, indicating periods of severe physiological stress, appears in approximately 40% of child remains from major Viking settlements. Each line represents a period when growth temporarily halted due to malnutrition or severe illness. By counting and analysing these lines, bioarchaeologists can reconstruct the rhythm of hardship in a child's life, often showing seasonal patterns of deprivation or community-wide disease events. At Birka, Sweden's prominent trading centre, excavated child remains show evidence of multiple parasitic infections. Roundworm, tapeworm and lice were common companions of Viking children, their presence confirmed through both preserved eggs in cesspit remains and the distinctive bone lesions they sometimes caused. These parasites competed for nutrients in already undernourished bodies, causing chronic anemia and weakening children's resistance to other diseases. A particularly poignant find from Gotland reveals the skeleton of a child, approximately 10 years old, who survived a serious cranial injury, likely from a fall or blow, only to die years later from an unrelated cause. The skull shows remarkable healing, evidence of care provided by family members who cleaned the wound, perhaps applied herbal poultices, and ensured the child rested during recovery. Such finds challenged the notion that Viking society simply discarded the weak or injured. Many families clearly invested significant resources in nursing children through serious health crises. The archaeological record also reveals evidence of epidemic diseases that periodically devastated communities. At Fusing in northern Germany, a Viking Age settlement revealed what archaeologists call a catastrophe horizon, a layer containing multiple burials from a short time period, including many children. Analysis suggests an outbreak of what may have been smallpox, or a similar, highly contagious disease that particularly affected those with no prior exposure, the youngest members of society. What would it feel like to be a Viking child during such an outbreak? Imagine the confusion as playmates fell ill, as adults whispered anxiously, as normal routines collapsed. Perhaps you would have been sent to stay with relatives in isolated farmsteads, a primitive form of quarantine. Or perhaps your family would have appealed to Thor, or later to Christ, for protection. The psychological impact of living through such events, watching siblings or friends succumb to mysterious illnesses, surely shaped Viking children's understanding of life's fragility. Dental evidence from Viking children paints another dimension of daily discomfort. By age 10, most children show significant dental wear from coarse bread containing stone particles from millstones. Cavities were common despite the relatively low sugar diet, likely resulting from carbohydrate-rich foods and minimal dental hygiene. Abscesses evident in many child skulls would have caused persistent, severe pain, a constant companion for many young Vikings as they attempted to fulfill their daily responsibilities. The Norse approach to healing these various afflictions combined practical herbal knowledge with spiritual and magical elements. The archaeological record yields evidence of medicinal herbs in child burials, chamomile, yarrow, and other plants with genuine antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory properties. These were not merely superstitious remedies, but represented generations of empirical observation about what helped sick children recover. At Ribe in Denmark, a child's grave contained a small leather pouch with dried thyme and juniper berries, both effective against intestinal parasites when prepared correctly. The presence of these herbs suggests knowledgeable caregiving, an attempt to address the specific ailments afflicting the child, even if ultimately unsuccessful. Alongside practical herbal remedies, Viking families employed runic charms and amulets to combat disease. Several examples of fever amulets have been discovered, small wooden or bone tablets inscribed with runic sequences believed to drive away illness. One such amulet from Bergen, Norway, bears the inscription, "I drive away the spirits of illness that ride you." These were often placed near sick children or hung around their necks, combining psychological comfort with what Vikings would have considered genuine magical protection. The Egger stone, while not specifically mentioning childhood illness, references protection against ale sickness, possibly ergotism from contaminated grain, through runic power, evidence of the perceived connection between written spells and health outcomes in Norse culture. For a sick Viking child, seeing adults carve such protective runes would have provided reassurance that powerful forces were being marshalled for their recovery. The sagas mention healing practices specifically for children. In Egil's saga, a sick girl is treated by having runes carved to counteract those mistakenly cut by someone else, an early recognition of iatrogenic illness, where the attempted cure causes harm. The saga's description of Egil scraping away the harmful runes and burning the shavings, then cutting new, beneficial ones, demonstrates the complex ritual elements surrounding childhood healing. The transition from pagan to Christian healing practices created another layer of complexity. As Christianity spread through Viking lands, traditional healing methods incorporating Norse gods were gradually supplemented or replaced by Christian alternatives. Prayers to saints instead of gods, holy water instead of runic water, crosses instead of hammer amulets. At Sigtuna, Sweden, archaeologists discovered a child burial from the early Christian period containing both a Thor's hammer and a cross, evidence of a family hedging their spiritual bets during their child's final illness. Similar mixed evidence appears throughout the conversion period, suggesting that when a child's life hung in the balance, pragmatism often trumped religious orthodoxy. The most vulnerable period for Viking children came during weaning, typically between ages 2 and 3, when breast milk was gradually replaced with solid foods. This transition exposed children to new pathogens while simultaneously removing the immunological protection of mother's milk. Isotope analysis of child remains from this age range shows frequent evidence of malnutrition and infection. marking weaning as a dangerous threshold in the Viking life course. A study of child remains from Gotland shows that approximately 35% of children died before reaching age 5, with particular concentration in the 2 to 3 year range, the typical weaning period. Those who survived this dangerous transition faced better odds of reaching adulthood, having demonstrated their constitutional resilience. What did Viking parents feed their weaning children? Archaeological evidence from settlements and analysis of residues in pottery suggests a porridge-based transitional diet, primarily barley or oats cooked with milk or water. This simple food, while calorie sufficient, lacked the complete nutrition of breast milk, contributing to the health challenges of this life stage. For children who survived early childhood, physical trauma became an increasing risk as they began participating in household labour and training activities. Skeletal remains of Viking children aged 7 to 12 frequently show evidence of healed fractures, particularly in the forearms, suggesting falls, and ribs, suggesting impacts. These injuries reflect both accidents during work and deliberate toughening through combat training. At Trelleborg, a Viking fortress site in Denmark, archaeologists discovered the remains of a boy approximately 12 years old, who died from a head injury consistent with weapons training, a blunt force trauma that likely resulted from a practice weapon rather than a battlefield injury. This grim find illustrates the fine line between training Viking children for adult roles and exposing them to potentially fatal risks. Seasonal threats created rhythmic patterns of danger throughout the Viking child's year. Winter brought respiratory infections, frostbite, and vitamin deficiencies. Spring carried the risk of food poisoning, as families consumed the last of stored provisions, sometimes after they had spoiled. Summer brought intestinal diseases from contaminated water sources, while fall presented risks of injuries during harvest activities. A Viking child who reached age 10 had already navigated countless health threats that would be easily preventable in the modern world. Their body would bear the marks of survival, perhaps slightly stunted from periods of malnutrition, dental issues causing chronic pain, scars from injuries, and the psychological imprints of having watched siblings or friends succumb to disease. Would you have been among the survivors? Would your body have fought off the parasites that colonized your intestines from contaminated water? Would your immune system have prevailed against the mysterious fevers that periodically swept through settlements? Would your bones have received sufficient nutrition to grow strong despite winter shortages? The psychological dimension of growing up surrounded by frequent death cannot be overlooked. How did Viking children process the commonplace loss of siblings, friends, and community members? The sagas suggest a cultural framework that emphasise stoicism and acceptance of fate, values likely instilled from earliest childhood as a psychological defence against overwhelming loss. In Gisla saga, when a child dies, the father remarks simply, "It is the way of the world that some must die so others may live." A fatalistic perspective that modern psychologists might view as a coping mechanism for societies with high child mortality. Children raised in this cultural context would have developed different expectations about life's permanence than modern children, perhaps viewing each day of health as a gift rather than an expectation. For those children who survived the gauntlet of early health challenges, daily life brought its own demands and dangers, a structured existence where play and work blended together, preparing young Vikings for adult roles in a society where childhood itself was brief and purposeful. Third, daily life of a Viking child. Dawn breaks over a small farmstead in the Vestfold region of Norway. The year is approximately 950 CE, and as the first grey light filters through the smoke hole of the longhouse roof, children are already stirring. A girl of 6 rises from her sleeping bench, shakes her younger brother awake, and moves immediately to her first task of the day, rekindling the central hearth fire from carefully preserved embers. Her quick, practiced movements show she has performed this essential duty hundreds of times before. The family's survival depends on her success. This scene, reconstructed from archaeological evidence and saga descriptions, illustrates a fundamental truth about Viking childhood. From the earliest age capable of useful work, children were integrated into the household economy as essential contributors. Their days followed rhythms dictated by necessity, the seasons, and their gradually increasing capabilities. Age-based responsibilities form the backbone of a Viking child's daily experience. By examining grave goods, studying skeletal evidence of repetitive activities, and analysing saga references, archaeologists and historians have reconstructed the progression of duties assigned to children at different developmental stages. The youngest children with assigned tasks, typically around age 4 or 5, began with simple but crucial responsibilities: carrying water from nearby sources, gathering kindling for fires, collecting eggs from nesting areas, and watching younger siblings. These tasks required minimal strength, but taught essential awareness of the homestead's needs and resources. Water carrying particularly has left physical evidence in child remains. Studies of Viking-age child skeletons show early development of muscle attachments on arm bones consistent with regular carrying of weighted containers. A child-sized wooden bucket found at Oseberg, with a capacity of approximately 2 litres, suggests equipment specifically designed for young water carriers, large enough to be useful, small enough for a child to manage. By ages 6 to 8, responsibilities expanded significantly. Boys typically began helping with animal husbandry, feeding livestock, cleaning stables, and eventually assisting with herding. Girls often started learning textile production, beginning with wool processing tasks like sorting and carding, before advancing to spinning and eventually weaving. The Bayeux Tapestry, while slightly post-Viking age, depicts children assisting with agricultural tasks, visual evidence that young workers were commonplace in medieval Scandinavian societies. Similarly, the Gotland picture stones show small figures participating in farming activities alongside adults, their size clearly indicating their youth. Archaeological evidence from Viking farmsteads includes child-sized tools, small rakes, diminutive sickles, and lightweight hoes scaled for young users. These weren't toys, but functional implements designed for real work. At Coppergate in York, England, in the area of Viking settlement known as Jorvik, excavations revealed small weaving tools, including a child-sized weaving sword, evidence that children were expected to contribute to textile production, the most time-consuming household industry. By ages 9 to 12, the division between boys' and girls' work became more pronounced, though with significant regional and family status variations. Boys increasingly participated in male-dominated activities: fishing, hunting, fieldwork, and basic woodworking. Girls focused more intensively on textile production, food preparation, dairy processing, and household management. The sagas occasionally offer glimpses of children at work. In Egil's saga, the protagonist is described at age 7 as big and strong as boys who were 12 or 13, and already participating in games and sports with much older children, an indication that physical capability, rather than strict age, often determines a child's role. Laxdæla saga mentions a boy of 12 helping with hay harvest, while Grettir's saga describes children of wealthy families being sent to the fishing stations to learn the work. Evidence that even high-status children were expected to understand basic subsistence activities. For most Viking children, education occurred through direct participation in household activities rather than formal instruction. They learned by watching, assisting, and gradually taking on more complex aspects of essential tasks. A girl learning to weave would first observe her mother or older sisters, then help with simple aspects like preparing the warp threads, before eventually managing the entire complex process independently. This apprenticeship model applied to virtually all skills. Boys learning woodworking began by simply holding tools for their fathers, or helping to gather materials before gradually being trusted with basic cutting and shaping tasks. By their early teens, many would be producing simple but functional items independently. The daily rhythm varied dramatically by season. Summer brought long days of intensive outdoor work, farming, fishing, hunting and gathering. Children might rise before dawn and work until sunset, with brief breaks for meals. Winter, with its limited daylight, compressed outdoor activities but intensified indoor production, particularly textile work, performed by firelight. Food and nutrition for Viking children reflected both their social status and the seasonal availability of resources. Isotope analysis of child remains from various sites shows significant variation in diet quality. Children from wealthy families show evidence of regular protein consumption, including meat and fish, while those from poorer households relied more heavily on grains and dairy, with meat appearing rarely in their diet. The typical Viking child's diet centred on barley or oat porridge, supplemented with dairy products, occasional meat or fish, seasonal vegetables, and foraged foods like berries and nuts. Evidence from coprolites, preserved feces, found at Viking sites confirms this diet and shows that many children harboured intestinal parasites from contaminated food and water, a constant drain on their nutritional status. Mealtimes themselves were communal affairs, with children eating alongside adults rather than separately. Sagas describe household members eating according to status, with the highest ranking individuals sitting nearest the head of the table. Children typically ate last, after adults had taken their portion, a practice that could leave younger family members with less food during times of scarcity. Sleep arrangements similarly reflected the communal nature of Viking households. Children didn't have private spaces, but slept on the same benches that served as seating during the day, often sharing sleeping furs with siblings or other family members. This arrangement provided necessary warmth during cold nights, but also meant that children were exposed to all household activities, including adult discussions, conflicts and intimacy. There were few childhood secrets in the Viking world. Clothing for Viking children was essentially miniature versions of adult garments, adapted for growth and rough use. Archaeological finds include small brooches, reduced-scale belt buckles, and child-sized shoes that confirm this pattern. Textile fragments from children's graves show the same materials and weaving techniques used for adults, though often of slightly coarser quality. Practical parents didn't waste the finest textiles on rapidly growing children prone to damaging their clothes during work and play. The sagas mention that children from wealthy families might receive new clothes at Yule celebrations, while poorer children wore handed-down garments, often repeatedly patched and repaired. A child's clothing thus visibly signalled their family status to the broader community. Despite their heavy work responsibilities, Viking children did play, though their games often served as training for adult skills rather than mere entertainment. Archaeological evidence includes toy wooden boats, miniature weapons, doll-like figures, and gaming pieces sized for small hands. These toys weren't mass-produced, but crafted within the household, often by older family members during winter evenings, when outdoor work was impossible. A particularly well-preserved find from Dublin, then a Viking settlement, includes a small wooden sword, carefully crafted to mimic the weight and balance of an actual weapon, while being safer for practice. Similar training weapons have been found at sites across the Viking world, suggesting a common approach to preparing boys for potential warrior roles. Girls' play often centred around miniature versions of household implements, tiny loom weights, spindle whirls, and cooking vessels that served as both toys and training tools. By playing at adult work, girls mastered the fundamental movements and processes they would need as women. Not all play was gender-specific. Board games like Hanafatafel, a strategic game somewhat similar to chess, were played by both boys and girls, teaching strategic thinking and planning. Archaeological finds include gaming pieces in children's graves, suggesting these games held significant cultural importance. Physical games and competitions featured prominently in Viking children's free time, particularly for boys. The sagas mention wrestling matches, stone-lifting contests, and mock battles that built strength and combat skills. These activities served as informal assessment of a child's potential. Those who excelled at physical contests were marked early for potential leadership or warrior roles. Storytelling formed another crucial element of Viking childhood experience. During winter evenings, when darkness fell early and outdoor work was impossible, families gathered around the central hearth to hear sagas, legends, and family histories recited by elders or travelling skalds, poets. Through these stories, children absorbed cultural values, religious beliefs, and practical knowledge embedded in narrative form. Imagine yourself as a Viking child of 9, sitting by the fire after a long day of work, listening to tales of gods and heroes while your hands stay busy with simple tasks like net mending or wood carving. The stories you hear shape your understanding of courage, honour, and proper behaviour, while simultaneously entertaining and binding you to your cultural tradition. The physical environment of Viking childhood varied significantly by region and family wealth. Most children grew up in longhouses, single-room structures with central hearths and multiple functions. Archaeological excavations at sites like Borg in Lofoten, Norway, and Stung in Iceland have revealed typical longhouse layouts, showing how families organised their living space. Children in these environments had little privacy and constant exposure to all aspects of family life, from birth to death. They witnessed slaughtering of animals, preparation of food, adult conflicts, sexual relationships, illness and dying, experiences largely hidden from modern children. This exposure created a practical understanding of life's full cycle that modern childhood, with its protected innocence, rarely provides. For children of thralls, living conditions were significantly worse. Archaeological evidence from thrall quarters shows cramped spaces with minimal heating and poor ventilation. Children born to thralls inherited their parents' status and began work earlier, with more demanding tasks and poorer nutrition than free children. Seasonal variations dramatically affected daily life. Summer brought relative plenty but intensive labour, with children often working from sunrise to sunset during crucial periods like harvest. Winter brought confinement, as families huddled in smoke-filled longhouses, conserving resources and focusing on indoor crafts. Spring was often the hungriest time, when stored food ran low before new growth provided fresh resources. Would you have thrived in this environment? Would your modern sensibilities have rebelled against the early responsibilities, the physical demands, the lack of privacy? Or would you have found satisfaction in your essential contribution to family survival, pride in mastering adult skills at a young age? The Viking child's daily life taught crucial lessons: resourcefulness in using available materials, resilience in facing harsh conditions, patience in performing repetitive tasks, and community interdependence, as each family member's work contributed to collective survival. These values, instilled through daily practice rather than abstract teaching, created individuals uniquely adapted to thrive in the challenging Norse environment. By modern standards, Viking children's lives seem brutally difficult, filled with hard physical labour, minimal comforts, and constant exposure to hardship. Yet archaeological evidence suggests most children who survived early health challenges grew into remarkably robust adults, their bodies strengthened by work that began in early childhood. The transition from childhood to adulthood wasn't marked by age alone, but by capability and contribution. A physically mature 12-year-old performing adult work might be treated as an adult, while a smaller, less capable 14-year-old might still be considered a child. This flexible, capability-based definition of childhood created a gradual transition rather than the abrupt shift often experienced in modern societies. For some children, however, daily life took a dramatically different form. Those born into or thrust into servitude faced challenges even beyond those experienced by free Viking children. Slavery and foster age. The small boy huddled in the corner of the longship, his wrists bound with rough rope that cut into his skin. Just days ago, he had been playing near his village in the British Isles when the dragon-prowed ships appeared on the horizon. Now his family was dead or scattered, and he was cargo, human merchandise destined for the slave markets of Hedeby or Birka. This child had just entered the lowest stratum of Viking society, thraldom. Across the Norse world, in a stark contrast, another boy of similar age was ceremonially welcomed into a chieftain's household. Though separated from his birth family, this child, a foster son, would receive training, connections and opportunities that would shape his future as a leader. His placement represented not degradation, but alliance, an honour for both his birth family and his foster family. These two systems, slavery and foster care, represented opposite ends of the spectrum of childhood experience in Viking society, yet both involved the displacement of children from their birth families and their integration into new households for economic, political, and social purposes. Slavery was a fundamental institution in Viking society, with thralls, slaves, forming the bottom layer of the social hierarchy. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that a significant percentage of the Norse population, perhaps 10% or more, lived in bondage. Many of these enslaved people were captured during raids on foreign shores, but some were born into slavery, inheriting their status from enslaved parents. Children born to thrall women faced a life predetermined by their mother's status. The Gulathing law, a medieval Norwegian legal code, explicitly states that children follow the mother's condition, meaning a child born to an enslaved woman was automatically a slave, regardless of the father's status. This matrilineal transmission of slave status created generations of Norse-born thralls, some with physical appearances indistinguishable from their owners. Archaeological evidence of child thralls comes primarily from burial contexts. At several Viking sites, including Flakstad in Norway, archaeologists have discovered burials that deviate markedly from normal Norse practices. Bodies placed in shallow, unmarked graves, sometimes in unusual positions or with evidence of rough handling. Isotope analysis of these remains sometimes reveals foreign origins, suggesting captured individuals, while others show local signatures, indicating Norse-born slaves. The physical remains of child thralls tell stories of hardship through their bones. Analysis of skeletal material from presumed thrall burials shows evidence of malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and untreated medical conditions at rates significantly higher than those found in free children's remains. At Trelleborg in Denmark, the skeleton of a child around 10 years old, buried in a manner suggesting thrall status, shows vertebral compression consistent with carrying heavy loads from an early age. Physical evidence of the brutal labour expectations placed on enslaved children. What was daily life like for a child thrall? The sagas provide some glimpses, though they rarely make enslaved children their focus. In Egil's saga, thrall children are mentioned performing the most menial tasks, cleaning animal stalls, carrying water, and doing basic food preparation. The Rigstöla, an Eddic poem describing Norse social classes, characterises thrall children as having wrinkled skin, gnarled knuckles, and ugly faces, physical descriptions reflecting both poor nutrition and the poem's intent to naturalise social hierarchy. Child thralls typically received minimal food, enough to maintain their working capacity, but little more. Archaeological evidence suggests they ate diets heavily dominated by grains with little protein, leading to developmental issues and reduced adult height. They slept in the poorest locations within the longhouse, nearest to doors where drafts were strongest, farthest from the central hearth's warmth, or in separate outbuildings with animals. Their clothing consisted of the coarsest wool and linen, often hand-me-downs that had already been worn by multiple owners. The Rigstöla describes thrall children wearing shabby clothes and going barefoot always, a significant hardship in the cold Norse climate. Training for thrall children focused exclusively on developing their value as workers. Girls learned basic textile production, food preparation, and cleaning. Boys were taught animal husbandry, basic farming, and load-bearing tasks. Unlike free children, who gradually learned more specialised skills, thralls were generally limited to unskilled labour that required strength but minimal expertise. Punishment for thrall children could be severe. The law codes permitted masters to physically discipline their human property with few restrictions. The Frostathing law, another Norwegian legal code, states that masters could not kill their thralls without cause, but could administer beatings as needed. a broad permission that left enslaved children vulnerable to abuse. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals thrall burials with evidence of healed fractures and injuries consistent with physical abuse. Yet even within this brutal system, variations existed. Household thralls, particularly those born within the household, sometimes developed more complex relationships with their owners than captured slaves. The sagas occasionally mention thrall children who grew up alongside their master's children, forming bonds that complicated their enslaved status. In Egil's saga, a thrall woman named Thorgerd nurses both her own child and her mistress's child, creating a relationship that later influences how her son is treated. The possibility of freedom existed for some thrall children, though it remained rare. Manumission, the granting of freedom, could occur through several paths. A master might free a particularly valued thrall as a reward for service. A thrall might save money to purchase their freedom. Or in the conversion period, masters sometimes freed thralls as pious acts. The Icelandic law code Gragas outlines specific procedures for manumission, indicating it was an established, if uncommon, practice. Archaeological evidence of freed thralls comes from graves that show a mixture of status indicators. Individuals buried with some grave goods suggesting free status, but in locations or positions indicating former thraldom. Isotope analysis sometimes reveals these individuals had foreign origins, but lived long-term in Norse communities, suggesting captured slaves who eventually gained freedom. For thrall children, the hope of eventual freedom might provide psychological sustenance through difficult years. The Norse concept of luck or fortune, hamingja, suggested that even a thrall's circumstances could change if fate favoured them. Stories of thralls who gained freedom and even prosperity circulated in Norse culture, providing aspirational narratives for enslaved children. At the opposite end of the social spectrum from thraldom, fosterage represented a prestigious form of child displacement that strengthened social bonds between families rather than severing them. In this practice, children, typically sons, from good families were sent to live with other households around age 7 or 8, where they would be raised alongside that family's biological children. Unlike modern foster care, which typically addresses family dysfunction, Norse fosterage was a mark of alliance and honour. Having your child selected as a foster son for a powerful chieftain represented a significant social achievement. For the foster family, raising another family's heir created lasting bonds of obligation and loyalty that could prove politically valuable. The sagas contain numerous examples of fosterage arrangements. In Laxdæla saga, Olaf the Peacock sends his son Kjartan to be fostered, creating an alliance that influences subsequent events. In Egil's saga, the protagonist himself becomes a foster father to strengthen his network of supporters. These literary examples are supported by historical sources mentioning fosterage among elite Norse families. What was life like for a foster child? Generally, foster sons received the same or better treatment than the biological children of their foster family. They ate the same food, wore similar clothing, and received comparable training. In some cases, foster children might receive special attention as representatives of important allied families. The educational aspect of fosterage was particularly significant. Foster fathers were expected to teach their charges essential skills, weapon use, legal knowledge, property management, and social customs. Foster mothers oversaw the development of appropriate behaviour and social refinement. This education prepared foster children for leadership roles while simultaneously immersing them in their foster family's perspective and interests. The emotional dimension of fosterage varied widely. Some foster relationships developed deep affection, with foster parents treating their charges as true family members. The sagas describe foster fathers who loved their foster sons as much as or more than their biological children. In other cases, the relationship remained more formal and political, with both parties fulfilling obligations without developing strong emotional bonds. For the child experiencing fosterage, the transition could be challenging despite its prestigious nature. Separation from birth parents at a young age, the need to adapt to a new household's customs, and the pressure to represent one's birth family honourably created significant stress. The sagas occasionally hint at the emotional difficulty of these transitions, though they generally focus more on the political implications than on children's feelings. Between the extremes of thraldom and elite fosterage existed other forms of child displacement in Viking society. Children orphaned by disease, accident or violence might be taken in by extended family members, a practice mentioned in several sagas and supported by archaeological evidence of households containing children with different genetic profiles. In some cases, children were given to others who could better provide for them during times of hardship. The Icelandic sagas, particularly those set during famine periods, mention families sending children to wealthier relatives or allies when they couldn't feed them, a practice that occupied a middle ground between fosterage and abandonment. Children might also be placed as apprentices with skilled craftspeople, particularly for specialised trades like metalworking that required extensive training. Archaeological evidence from Viking craftworking sites sometimes includes smaller tools or practice pieces created by apprentice hands, suggesting the presence of children learning trades outside their family specialisation. The Norse expansion across the North Atlantic created another context for child displacement. As Vikings settled Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, they sometimes brought children, both their own and captured thralls, to these new territories. Archaeological evidence from early Icelandic settlements shows the presence of children from the earliest phases of colonisation, indicating that even hazardous settlement ventures included complete family groups. For all displaced children, whether thralls, foster children, orphans, or colonists, adaptation to new circumstances required significant resilience. Language differences presented immediate challenges for captured children from non-Norse regions. Cultural practices around food, hygiene, religion, and daily routines created ongoing friction. The psychological impacts of separation from birth families, particularly for captured thralls, created trauma that likely persisted throughout their lives. How would you have fared if suddenly transplanted into a Viking household as either a thrall or foster child? Would your modern sensibilities have made adaptation harder or easier? Would you have found ways to preserve your original identity while functioning in your new role, or would you have assimilated completely to survive? The stark contrast between thraldom and fosterage highlights the extreme inequality of Viking society, a world where some children were valuable alliance tokens, while others were merely human tools. Yet both systems reveal the fundamental Norse understanding of children as adaptable resources whose primary value lay in their potential contribution to family and community, survival and prosperity. This pragmatic view of childhood extended to another crucial aspect of Viking child rearing: the training of future warriors, a process that began in earliest childhood and intensified as children approached physical maturity. Warrior training and coming of age. The wooden sword whistled through the air as the boy, no more than 8 winters old, executed a perfect cutting motion. His father nodded approvingly, then demonstrated the next sequence of movements. Nearby, other children practiced with similar training weapons, their small bodies already developing the muscle memory that might one day save their lives on distant battlefields or during coastal raids. This was no mere play, but deadly serious preparation for a world where violence was commonplace, and martial skill often meant the difference between life and death. For many Viking children, particularly boys, warrior training began almost as soon as they could walk. Archaeological evidence from across the Norse world confirms that mock combat formed a central component of childhood experience. Toy wooden weapons, swords, axes and spears scaled for small hands, appear frequently in settlement excavations, their worn surfaces and repair marks indicating heavy use rather than occasional play. At Birka in Sweden, archaeologists discovered a child-sized leather helmet and wooden shield in a boy's grave, training equipment that mirrored adult war gear in design, but not materials. Similar finds from Dublin, York and Hedeby suggest a common approach to warrior preparation across the Viking world: transcending regional variations in other cultural practices. The sagas provide literary confirmation of this archaeological evidence. In Egil's saga, the protagonist is described as participating in mock battles by age 7, already showing the fierce temperament that would make him a feared warrior. Grettir's saga similarly mentions young boys organising themselves into combat teams, with leaders chosen based on physical prowess and fighting skill. A miniature version of adult warrior bands. What distinguished Viking warrior training from simple rough and tumble play was its systematic nature and clear progression. Children began with basic movements: how to grip a weapon, how to stand, how to deliver simple strikes. As they grew, training incorporated more complex techniques: shield use, defensive movements, tactical awareness, and eventually, formation fighting. This progression is reflected in the archaeological record. Simpler training weapons appear in contexts associated with younger children, while more sophisticated practice equipment corresponds to older age groups. At Hedeby, a training progression can be traced from simple wooden sticks used by the youngest children to more carefully balanced wooden swords for older boys, and finally to blunted metal training weapons for adolescents approaching warrior age. Physical conditioning accompanied technical training. The sagas mention specific exercises designed to build warrior attributes: stone lifting contests to develop strength, running and swimming races for endurance, and wrestling matches to improve balance and grappling skills. These activities weren't separated from daily life, but integrated into work and play, ensuring that potential warriors developed functional fitness rather than isolated physical attributes. At Trelleborg, one of Denmark's circular Viking fortresses, archaeological evidence suggests designated training areas where young men practiced formation fighting and tactical manoeuvres. Similar spaces have been identified at other military sites, indicating that formal training became more structured as boys approached fighting age. The psychological dimension of warrior training was equally important. Viking children were raised on stories of glorious battles, heroic last stands, and the honour of dying well. The Eddic poems and sagas provided models of proper warrior behaviour that children absorbed from earliest memory. Through these narratives, Viking children internalised crucial cultural values: courage in the face of certain death, loyalty to one's comrades, and the imperative to uphold family honour through martial prowess. The Havamal, a collection of Old Norse poems from the Poetic Edda, offered specific wisdom for young men preparing for warrior life. Its verses provided practical advice. A man should never step 1 foot beyond his weapons. The unwise man stays awake all night worrying about his enemies, alongside philosophical perspectives on fate and proper conduct. These teachings weren't abstract concepts, but practical guidelines for survival in a violent world. By age 12 to 15, depending on physical development and social circumstances, many Viking boys participated in their first raids or battles. This transition marked a crucial threshold between childhood and adulthood, the moment when training met reality, when practice became performance with life or death consequences. Archaeological evidence of this transition appears in several forms. At cemetery sites, the graves of teenage boys sometimes contain real weapons rather than training equipment, signalling their status as novice warriors. Skeletal remains occasionally show evidence of healed combat injuries in individuals as young as 14 or 15, physical proof of adolescent participation in violence. The sagas describe first raids as formative experiences, often under the supervision of fathers or other male relatives. In Egil's saga, the protagonist joins his first Viking expedition at age 12, serving on his father's ship. In Grettir's saga, the main character kills his first man at 14 during a dispute over swimming rights, an event that foreshadows his troubled relationship with society, but also marks his transition to adult status. What emotions might a Viking boy experience before his first raid? The sagas, with their focus on heroic action rather than interior life, rarely address this question directly. Yet occasional glimpses suggest a complex mixture of excitement, fear, and determination to prove oneself worthy. In Laxdæla saga, a young man before his first combat is described as neither pale nor flushed, neither sad nor smiling, suggesting the intense self-control expected even from novice warriors. For girls, the path to adulthood followed a different, but equally structured progression. While not typically trained for primary combat roles, archaeological and textual evidence suggests some young women received basic weapons training for household defence. Grave finds occasionally include female skeletons buried with weapons, particularly in frontier regions where all community members might need to participate in defence. The controversial concept of shield maidens, female warriors who participated in raids and battles alongside men, remains debated among historians. While the archaeological evidence includes some female burials with warrior equipment, these represent a small minority of women's graves. The sagas mention women who fought, but often in exceptional circumstances rather than as a standard role. What seems most likely based on the available evidence is that while most girls followed a domestic training path, exceptions existed, particularly in frontier regions, during periods of conflict, or among high-status families with martial traditions. These exceptions provided alternative models that some girls might aspire to, even if most followed more traditional gender roles. The standard female coming-of-age progression focused on household management skills, textile production, and eventually marriage preparation. Archaeological evidence shows that by their early teens, girls were producing high-quality textiles, managing food preservation, and participating in all aspects of household production. Their training culminated not in first raids, but in marriage negotiations and household establishment, transitions that typically occurred between ages 15 and 20. For both boys and girls, the transition to adulthood involved not just skill acquisition, but also ritual recognition. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests various coming-of-age ceremonies, though these varied by region and period. In some areas, boys received their first real weapons in public ceremonies that marked their status change from children to potential warriors. Girls might receive keys symbolising household authority or special jewellery marking their marriageable status. Religious elements infused these transitions. In pre-Christian times, young men might dedicate themselves to Thor or Odin through rituals involving symbolic death and rebirth. The sagas mention young warriors swearing oaths on arm rings dedicated to Thor or making sacrifices before their first raids. With Christianization, these practices were gradually replaced by confirmation ceremonies that served similar social functions while redirecting religious loyalty. The berserker tradition represents a specialised and controversial aspect of Viking warrior training. These legendary fighters, described in the sagas as entering trance-like states of battle fury, have captured modern imagination. But what was the reality behind the myths, particularly regarding young warriors? Archaeological evidence provides few clear answers about berserkers. No definitive material culture has been identified as specifically associated with berserker practice. However, certain male graves contain unusual amulets and ritual objects that might relate to warrior cult practices, potentially including berserker traditions. The textual evidence is more substantial but problematic. The sagas describe berserkers as warriors who fought in a frenzied state, sometimes wearing bear or wolf skins. The term berserker likely derives from bear shirt or bear shirt, and supposedly impervious to pain during their battle rage. These accounts, however, were mostly written centuries after the Viking Age by Christian authors, who may have exaggerated or misunderstood earlier practices. What seems most likely is that certain warrior training traditions included techniques for managing fear and pain through mental conditioning, possibly enhanced by ritual practices, and perhaps sometimes by consciousness-altering substances. Young warriors might be initiated into these techniques as part of their transition to adult fighting roles, learning to channel fear into controlled aggression. For young Viking men approaching adulthood, the prospect of joining elite warrior bands represented the pinnacle of aspiration. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with retinues of professional warriors, like the Trelleborg fortresses or the Royal Hall at Leyra, shows that these groups included some very young men, perhaps as young as 15 or 16, training alongside seasoned veterans. The social dimension of warrior training extended beyond technical skill development. Young Vikings learned complex honour codes governing violence, when it was appropriate, how it should be conducted, and what consequences might follow. The Icelandic sagas particularly emphasise these codes, describing elaborate systems of challenge, compensation, and blood feud that structured violent interaction. Young warriors also learned practical skills beyond weapon use: how to maintain equipment, how to move in formation, how to establish camps during campaigns, and how to assess enemy strengths and weaknesses. Archaeological evidence from Viking military sites shows specialised training in skills like fort construction, ship handling, and siege techniques, all essential knowledge for successful raiding and warfare. As Christianity spread through the Viking world, warrior training incorporated new elements while preserving core practices. Christian symbols appeared on weapons and armour, prayers replaced pagan rituals before battle, and church teachings influenced codes of conduct. Yet the fundamental approach, beginning training in early childhood, progressing through increasingly realistic practice, and culminating in actual combat experience during adolescence, remained consistent throughout the Viking Age. Would modern children adapt successfully to this training system? Would today's parenting norms even permit the systematic preparation for violence that characterised Viking childhood? The physical and psychological toughening that Norse children underwent from earliest years created individuals prepared for hardship in ways few modern people could match. For those Viking children who successfully navigated the path to warrior adulthood, the rewards could be substantial: status, wealth from raiding, and the respect of their community. For those who failed, who showed cowardice, who lacked necessary skills, or who suffered disabling injuries during training, the consequences could be severe: social ostracism, reduced marriage prospects, and lifelong shame. The archaeological record occasionally reveals these failures: skeletons of teenage boys with injuries that would have prevented warrior service, sometimes buried with diminished grave goods or in marginal cemetery locations. These silent witnesses remind us that not all children successfully completed the demanding path to Viking adulthood, even when they survived the physical challenges of early childhood. For all Viking children, whether destined for warrior roles or other adult functions, religious training formed another crucial aspect of preparation for adulthood, an element that underwent dramatic transformation during the Viking Age, as Christianity gradually replaced traditional Norse beliefs. Childhood and religion. The small boy stood before the carved wooden image of Thor, his eyes wide as his father placed a miniature hammer amulet around his neck. "May Thor's strength protect you," the father intoned, completing a ritual that had been performed for countless generations. Across the settlement, another child, this one a girl of similar age, knelt before a crude wooden cross as a Christian priest made the sign of blessing over her bowed head. Two children, two faiths, one rapidly changing world. The Viking Age spanned a period of profound religious transition across northern Europe. When the period began in the late 8th century, traditional Norse polytheism dominated Scandinavian religious life. By its end in the mid-11th century, Christianity had become the official religion throughout the Norse world. This transformation fundamentally altered how children were introduced to religious concepts, how they participated in spiritual practices, and how they understood their place in the cosmic order. Archaeological evidence reveals this religious transition through changes in burial practices, ritual spaces, and personal religious items. At Birka in Sweden, child burials from the early Viking period typically contain Thor's hammer amulets, small figurines of Norse gods, or other pagan religious items. By the late 10th century, these same burial grounds show a shift toward Christian symbols, crosses, prayer beads, and Christian-influenced grave orientations, often appearing alongside traditional items in the same graves. This material evidence suggests that many Viking children grew up in religiously mixed environments during the conversion period, exposed to both traditional beliefs and Christian teachings. Their religious identity was likely fluid rather than fixed, incorporating elements from both traditions as families navigated the changing spiritual landscape. For children raised in traditional Norse religion, before Christianization, religious education began with household rituals and stories. Archaeological evidence from pre-Christian settlements shows that most religious activity occurred within or near the home, rather than in specialized temples. Children would have observed and gradually participated in family offerings to household gods, seasonal celebrations, and protective rituals integrated into daily life. The material culture of childhood piety included protective amulets, particularly Thor's hammers for boys and Freya symbols for girls, sized appropriately for children and often found in children's graves. These items weren't merely decorative, but served as active spiritual protection, physical manifestations of divine favour that children would have been taught to value and preserve. The gods themselves played different roles in children's religious understanding. Thor, with his straightforward strength and protection of humans against chaotic forces, appears to have been particularly associated with children in the archaeological record. Child-sized Thor's hammers are among the most common religious items in children's graves, and sagas occasionally mention children's special relationship with this accessible protective deity. Freya and Frigg, goddesses associated with fertility, motherhood, and domestic prosperity, feature prominently in artifacts from girls' graves, suggesting their importance in female religious socialization. Archaeological evidence includes small figurines of these goddesses found in contexts associated with children, particularly adolescent girls approaching marriageable age. Odin, the complex god of wisdom, poetry, death and magic, appears less frequently in children's context, becoming more prominent in artifacts associated with adolescent and adult males. This pattern suggests a graduated introduction to the Norse pantheon, with children first connecting to more accessible deities before engaging with more complicated divine figures as they matured. The Eddic poems and sagas provided children with narratives that explained cosmic order and modelled relationships between humans and gods. These stories weren't merely entertainment, but fundamental religious education. Archaeological evidence of this narrative tradition includes small carved figures depicting scenes from myths found in children's play areas, and occasionally in children's graves, physical props that may have been used in religious storytelling. Children in traditional Norse households participated in seasonal religious festivals that marked the agricultural year and honoured specific deities. Archaeological evidence from festival sites includes small footprints preserved in clay floors and child-sized ritual implements, confirming children's active involvement rather than mere observation. The midwinter festival, later known as Yule, seems to have been particularly significant for children. Archaeological evidence from midwinter celebration sites includes toys and game pieces, suggesting gift-giving to children was already a feature of this festival before Christian influence. The sagas mention children receiving new clothes, small weapons, or tools at Yule celebrations, practical gifts that also mark their growing capabilities. How did Viking children conceptualize the afterlife before Christian influences? Archaeological evidence suggests a complex understanding that varied by region and social status. In some areas, children's graves contain miniature versions of adult grave goods, small ships, weapons, or household items, suggesting belief in a continuation of earthly activities after death. In other regions, particularly those with earlier Christian contact, child burials show more ambiguous patterns, perhaps reflecting uncertain or transitional beliefs. The conversion to Christianity brought significant changes to children's religious experiences. Archaeological evidence from the conversion period, roughly 10th to 11th centuries, shows the gradual introduction of new religious practices alongside traditional ones. Children's graves from this period often contain both Thor's hammers and crosses, suggesting families hedging their spiritual bets during uncertain times. Baptism replaced the traditional Norse naming ceremony, transferring spiritual authority from the family to the church. Archaeological evidence of this transition includes the appearance of small baptismal fonts in early church sites and Christian amulets replacing traditional protective symbols in children's graves. The timing of baptism, whether performed immediately after birth, as the church preferred, or delayed until children were older, varied during the conversion period, reflecting the tension between new requirements and traditional practices. Christian education introduced new concepts that would have been foreign to children raised in traditional Norse religion. Original sin, salvation through faith rather than deeds, and a single all-powerful deity rather than multiple gods with specific domains. Archaeological evidence of this educational shift includes small catechism tablets and prayer beads found in children's contexts from the late Viking period. The shift from a heroic warrior ethos to Christian values of humility and forgiveness created particular tensions for boys' socialization. Traditional training emphasized courage, strength, and sometimes merciless action toward enemies, while Christian teachings stressed turning the other cheek and loving one's enemies. Material culture from the conversion period shows this tension through items that combine warrior and Christian symbolism. Crosses engraved on weapon handles, for instance, suggesting attempts to reconcile these competing value systems. For girls, the transition may have been somewhat less contradictory. The Christian emphasis on maternal virtues, exemplified by the Virgin Mary, had some parallels with traditional veneration of goddesses like Frigg and Freya. Archaeological evidence shows a relatively smooth transition in female religious items, with Marian symbols gradually replacing goddess symbols in contexts associated with girls and young women. The physical spaces of religious experience changed dramatically with Christianization. Traditional worship occurred primarily outdoors or in multi-purpose halls, with children participating alongside adults in ceremonies integrated into community life. Christian worship moved indoors to dedicated churches with more formal, structured participation and often age-segregated roles. Archaeological evidence of this transition includes the appearance of child-sized church furnishings, small benches, miniature kneelers, and youth-oriented devotional objects in early Scandinavian churches. These items suggest that while religious practice became more formalised, specific accommodations were made for children's participation in the new faith. Children played specific roles in both religious traditions. In pre-Christian practice, archaeological and textual evidence suggests children sometimes served as assistants in sacrificial rituals, particularly adolescents approaching adult status. The sagas mention young people helping to prepare sacrificial animals, distribute sacred food, and maintain ritual spaces. In Christian practice, children were incorporated as altar servers, choir members, and participants in religious processions. Archaeological evidence includes small liturgical items sized for children's use found at early church sites throughout Scandinavia. These roles provided formal religious training, while integrating young people into the new religious community. How did children themselves experience this religious transition? The archaeological record can't directly answer this question, but it provides tantalising clues. Children's drawings scratched into church walls from the early Christian period sometimes include traditional Norse symbols alongside Christian ones, suggesting young people actively process and combine elements from both traditions. Play items from the conversion period sometimes show children incorporating religious concepts into their games. A particularly interesting find from Lund, Sweden, includes a set of small wooden figures that could be arranged to depict either biblical scenes or traditional Norse stories, a toy that allowed children to explore both religious traditions through play. Children in the Norse myths themselves provided models for young Vikings' understanding of their place in the cosmic order. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain child figures from mythology held special significance for Viking children. Small amulets depicting Magni and Modi, Thor's sons, appear in boys' graves, while images of young goddess figures like Hanos, Freya's daughter, appear in girls' contexts. These divine children in Norse mythology often represented continuity and renewal. Baldur's son who avenges his father, Magni, who inherits Thor's hammer, and other divine offspring, embodied the concept that children would carry forward cosmic order even after the current gods fell at Ragnarok. This powerful message, that children represented a hope for renewal even after catastrophic change, may have provided comfort during the turbulent conversion period. The sagas describe religious tensions playing out within families, often along generational lines. Younger members typically accepted Christianity more readily than elders, creating household religious divisions that children had to navigate. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows this division materially, with younger family members buried with Christian items, while older generations maintained traditional practices. For children caught between traditions, the experience could be confusing, but also empowering. The sagas occasionally mention young people making independent religious choices, sometimes against family tradition. The archaeological record supports these accounts through finds like secret Christian amulets hidden in otherwise traditional contexts, suggesting young people maintaining personal religious identities that differed from family norms. As Christianity became established, children's religious education became more formalised. Archaeological evidence from the late Viking Age includes teaching tools like wooden alphabet boards with prayers, simplified illustrated biblical texts, and mnemonic devices for learning catechisms. These items represent a shift towards systematic religious instruction rather than the experiential learning that characterised traditional practice. The timing of religious transitions in children's lives also changed. Traditional Norse practice included no single moment of religious maturity, but rather a gradual increase in participation. Christian practice introduced specific thresholds, baptism, first communion, confirmation, that marked religious development according to age, rather than individual capability or family judgment. Archaeological evidence of these new thresholds includes special clothing and jewellery associated with confirmation ceremonies appearing in adolescent contexts from the late Viking period. These items suggest that religious transitions became important markers of social status and development as Christianity became established. Would you have found the old gods more compelling than the White Christ? Would you have hidden Thor's hammer under your clothes while attending the new church with your family? Or would you have embraced the new faith with the enthusiasm the sagas sometimes attribute to young converts? The archaeological record suggests that many children experienced elements of both traditions, creating syncretic personal beliefs that helped them navigate a changing world. The stories of legendary children preserved in the sagas provided another source of models and meaning for young Vikings growing up between traditions. These narratives of exceptional youth, some historical, some mythologized, offered templates for understanding childhood challenges and aspirations in a world of constant change. Legendary children of the sagas. The firelight danced across the rapt faces of the children as the skald's voice rose and fell, weaving tales of legendary youths whose deeds had shaped the Norse world. Listen now, he intoned, to how young Olaf, not much older than some of you, survived exile and rose to become king. Listen to how Egil, a child of 7 winters, took his first life with the axe that hangs now in our hall. These weren't merely stories for entertainment. They were educational tools, moral guides, and aspirational models for Viking children, seeking to understand their place in a complex and often dangerous world. The sagas, prose narratives recording Norse history, legend, and family stories, preserve accounts of remarkable children whose experiences reflected and shaped Viking cultural values. Archaeological evidence confirms that these narratives weren't confined to elite entertainment, but permeated daily life across social classes. Carved wooden figures depicting saga scenes have been found in children's play contexts, at sites ranging from wealthy longhouses to humble farm dwellings, suggesting these stories formed a common cultural framework for Viking childhood. Olaf Tryggvason's youth, as recounted in Heimskringla and his dedicated saga, provided one of the most compelling narratives of childhood resilience. Born shortly after his father's death at the hands of political rivals, infant Olaf fled with his mother through forests in winter, was captured by Estonian pirates, separated from his mother, and sold into slavery, all before the age of 3. His eventual recognition by a relative, redemption from slavery, and rise to become one of Norway's most significant kings offered a powerful narrative of overcoming childhood adversity. Archaeological evidence suggests this story resonated particularly with children in precarious circumstances. Small wooden figures resembling the saga descriptions of young Olaf have been found in children's contexts at trading centres like Hedeby and Birka, where many children would have experienced displacement and uncertain status. These figures, sometimes showing evidence of extensive handling, may have served as talismans of hope for children navigating difficult circumstances. For boys training for warrior roles, Egil Skallagrimsson's childhood provided a more problematic but equally compelling model. According to Egil's saga, he killed another boy at age 7 during a ball game dispute, composed his first poetry at age 3, and showed both extraordinary physical strength and ungovernable temper from earliest childhood. His story explored the thin line between exceptional talent and dangerous uncontrollability, a tension many Viking families would have recognised in their own gifted but difficult children. Archaeological evidence of Egil's cultural impact includes small axes found in children's graves, not functional weapons, but symbolic items possibly referencing his famous childhood killing. These finds suggest that even Egil's more troubling actions were incorporated into cultural models of exceptional childhood, perhaps serving as cautionary examples alongside his more admirable qualities. Female legendary children appeared less frequently in the sagas, but provided crucial models for girls. Gudrun Osvifsdottir from Laxdela saga, whose childhood dreams predicted her tumultuous adult relationships, offered a template for understanding female prophetic gifts and their consequences. Archaeological evidence of her cultural significance includes small female figurines with prophetic symbols found in girls' graves, suggesting her story helped frame understanding of feminine spiritual power. Helga the Fair, whose beauty and grace are described from earliest childhood in Gunnlaug's saga, represented another female archetype, the exceptional child whose qualities attract attention and create both opportunities and dangers. Archaeological evidence includes elaborate grooming implements in young girls' graves, suggesting cultural emphasis on developing feminine qualities celebrated in such narratives. Beyond individual saga characters, certain childhood archetypes recurred across Norse narratives, creating recognisable patterns that helped Viking children understand social expectations. The fostered prince, exemplified by figures like Olaf Tryggvason and Harald Hardrada, demonstrated how children separated from birth families could thrive through resilience and loyal service to foster kin. This narrative pattern would have resonated particularly with children in fosterage arrangements, providing models for successful navigation of divided loyalties. The Child Avenger, a youth who witnesses family tragedy and dedicates their life to eventual retribution, appears repeatedly in the sagas. Archaeological evidence suggests this motif's cultural importance through finds like the Sønder Kirkeby runestone from Denmark, which commemorates a father's death and implicitly charges his son with the responsibility of remembrance and possible revenge. Such cultural patterns shape children's understanding of their obligations to family honour across generations. The precocious poet, exemplified by Egil composing verses in early childhood, reflected the high value placed on verbal skill in Norse culture. Archaeological evidence includes small, runic practice pieces created by children learning this important skill, some attempting to replicate famous verses mentioned in the sagas. These finds suggest that legendary examples inspired actual children's efforts to develop valued abilities. Conversion narratives featuring children appear frequently in sagas covering the Christianization period. Young Olaf Haraldsson, later St. Olaf, rejecting his pagan upbringing, or the children in Niall's saga who accept baptism before their elders, provided models for navigating religious change. Archaeological evidence of this narrative's impact includes children's graves showing early adoption of Christian practices, while adult burials in the same communities retained pagan elements, suggesting children sometimes led religious transformation within families. How did Viking children encounter these legendary narratives? Archaeological evidence suggests multiple pathways. Carved wooden figures and simple illustrated tablets found in children's contexts indicate visual storytelling aids. Specialised children's versions of common stories, simplified saga narratives, appear in the archaeological record as short runic texts on wood or bone, suggesting adaptation of complex narratives for younger audiences. The physical settings of storytelling can also be identified archaeologically. Many longhouses feature a distinct area near the central hearth, with bench arrangements suitable for gathering listeners. At some sites, these areas contain disproportionate concentrations of children's items, small toys, game pieces, and practice craft materials, suggesting children gathered there regularly, perhaps often for storytelling sessions during winter evenings when outdoor activities were limited. Beyond entertainment, these saga narratives served crucial educational functions. They transmitted practical knowledge embedded within stories: how young Olaf survived in the forest, how child characters navigated social conflicts, how legendary children demonstrated proper behaviour toward elders. Archaeological evidence of this educational function includes children's play scenarios, recreating saga scenes, visible through arrangements of toys and game pieces found in preserved play contexts. The sagas also provided psychological frameworks for understanding childhood challenges. Archaeological evidence suggests children actively used these narratives to process difficult experiences. At several sites, archaeologists have discovered small homemade figures resembling saga characters placed in household shrines or near children's sleeping areas, possibly serving as protective symbols or psychological aids during difficult transitions. The emotional impact of these stories on Viking children can only be inferred, but certain archaeological patterns suggest their profound influence. Children's graves sometimes contain items directly referencing saga narratives. A small boat model in the grave of a boy from a coastal community might reference young Olaf's sea journeys. A miniature sword in a child's grave might evoke the legendary weapons of saga heroes. These legendary narratives also shape children's understanding of geographical space and cultural boundaries. The sagas described young heroes travelling across the known world, from Norway to Russia, England to Constantinople, expanding children's mental maps beyond their immediate surroundings. Archaeological evidence suggests children incorporated these geographical concepts into play, creating miniature versions of saga journeys using toys and natural features in play areas. For children who would never travel far from their birthplaces, saga narratives provided vicarious experience of the broader Viking world. For those who would eventually participate in trade or raiding expeditions, these stories created expectations and frameworks for understanding foreign places and peoples. Either way, the legendary children of the sagas expanded the mental horizons of their young audiences. The transmission of these narratives across generations created continuity in cultural values despite the significant religious and social changes occurring throughout the Viking Age. Archaeological evidence shows remarkable consistency in certain children's artefacts, particularly those associated with saga narratives, even as adult material culture changed more rapidly in response to Christianization and increased foreign contact. Would modern children find the same resonance in these ancient stories? The themes certainly remain relevant: overcoming adversity, navigating family expectations, discovering personal talents, facing ethical dilemmas. Yet the specific challenges faced by saga children, exile, blood feuds, early participation in violence, reflect a harsher reality than most modern Western children encounter. What's perhaps most striking about the legendary children of the sagas is their agency, their capacity to make significant decisions and take meaningful actions despite their youth. Archaeological evidence suggests this wasn't merely literary convention, but reflected actual Viking childhood. Children's graves containing tools of adult trades, weapons, and symbols of responsibility indicate that young people were recognised as capable actors in their communities, much like their saga counterparts. This respect for children's capabilities coexisted with clear expectations for proper behaviour. The sagas frequently show exceptional children who nonetheless respect fundamental social boundaries. Young heroes who demonstrate courage while still showing appropriate deference to elders. Child prodigies who use their gifts in service to family rather than personal glory. Archaeological evidence of this balance includes children's items that combine play and practical functions, toys that doubled as training tools, games that taught strategic thinking, relevant to adult responsibilities. The legendary children of the sagas provided aspirational models that shaped real children's self-conception and behaviour. By identifying with these heroic figures, Viking children could frame their own hardships as tests of character rather than merely suffering to be endured. Archaeological evidence of this identification includes children's personal items inscribed with names or symbols associated with saga heroes, suggesting young Vikings actively connected themselves to these legendary predecessors. For Viking parents, these narratives offered frameworks for understanding their own children's development. A particularly strong or willful child might be compared to young Egil. A thoughtful, verbal child might evoke young Njal. A beautiful daughter might recall young Helga. Archaeological evidence suggests parents sometimes emphasized these connections through naming practices and gift choices that linked their children to saga figures with similar qualities. The emotional lives of Viking children, their fears, attachments, griefs, and joys, found expression and context through these shared narratives. While the archaeological record cannot directly preserve feelings, it provides evidence of the frameworks through which emotions were processed and expressed, the stories that helped Viking children understand their inner lives in culturally meaningful ways. These emotional dimensions of Viking childhood, glimpsed through both saga narratives and archaeological evidence, reveal a world where strong attachments formed despite harsh conditions, where family bonds, though differently expressed than in modern contexts, nevertheless created the foundation for children's development and resilience. Emotional lives and family bonds. The small hands worked carefully, placing stones in a circular pattern around the tiny grave. Inside lay the body of an infant, wrapped in fine wool and surrounded by wildflowers. A girl of about 8, the baby's sister, completed her task and stepped back as her mother placed a small wooden Thor's hammer beside the wrapped bundle. No words were spoken, but the careful arrangement of the grave, the quality of the shroud, and the personal amulet told a story of attachment and loss that transcended the centuries. This scene, reconstructed from archaeological evidence at a Viking farmstead in Iceland, challenges simplistic notions that harsh living conditions prevented emotional attachment to children in Norse society. The archaeological record reveals numerous examples of carefully prepared child burials, suggesting that despite high mortality rates, Viking families formed strong bonds with their children and grieved their losses deeply. At Birka, archaeologists discovered the grave of a child approximately 4 years old, buried with an unusual collection of items: a miniature sword, a small wooden horse, a pouch of gaming pieces, and a lock of adult hair wrapped in linen, perhaps a parent's keepsake, placed with the child in death. The careful arrangement of these personal possessions, including both practical items and apparent sentimental tokens, suggests profound attachment rather than emotional distance. Runestone evidence provides some of the most direct testimonies of parental grief and attachment. The Kula runestone in Sweden bears the inscription, "Alrik raised this stone after Sibi, his son, who did not flee at Uppsala, but fought as long as he had weapons." This public monument expresses both pride in a son's courage and the parent's need to commemorate their child. Evidence that emotional bonds between generations were sufficiently powerful to motivate substantial memorial efforts. More poignantly, Some runestones commemorate children who died before achieving adult accomplishments. The Upland runestone 996 simply states, Inga raised this stone after Ragnfrid, her daughter. God help her soul. The brevity conveys dignity rather than emotional restraint, a mother's grief expressed through permanent memorial rather than temporary ritual. Material evidence of emotional attachment appears in more humble contexts as well. Excavations at Viking farmsteads throughout Scandinavia have uncovered children's toys showing extensive repair, wooden figures with carefully replaced limbs, dolls with multiple layers of mended clothing, toy boats with patched hulls. These objects, maintained far beyond their natural lifespan, suggest adults invested significant effort in maintaining children's treasured possessions. What forms of physical affection characterised Viking parent-child relationships? The archaeological record provides indirect evidence through spatial arrangements in longhouses. Many Viking dwellings show family sleeping platforms where children's and parents' sleeping places are adjoined, facilitating physical closeness during vulnerable nighttime hours. This arrangement served practical warming functions, but also created natural opportunities for physical comfort and reassurance. Small personal items found in children's graves sometimes suggest physical expressions of affection. Combs and grooming implements appear frequently, often showing signs of extensive use. The Oseberg ship burial, though belonging to an adult woman, included several fine combs and hair accessories, suggesting the importance of grooming as a form of care. Similar items in children's contexts may indicate that hair combing and physical grooming served as expressions of affection and care across generations. Lullabies and children's songs, though not directly preserved archaeologically, appear in later Nordic folk traditions, with elements likely dating to the Viking Age. References in the sagas to mothers singing to children suggest these practices were common. The archaeological contexts where such singing likely occurred, sleeping areas in longhouses, sometimes contain small musical instruments, like bone whistles, that may have accompanied children's songs. The sagas occasionally provide glimpses of parental tenderness, though these moments typically appear as background details rather than narrative focus. In Eagle's saga, the protagonist, otherwise portrayed as harsh and violent, is described carrying his young daughter on his knee and composing verses to make her laugh. Such literary moments, though possibly idealised, suggest cultural recognition of affectionate parent-child interactions as normal and expected. Archaeological evidence of children's emotional lives extends beyond family relationships to include friendships and peer bonds. Children's play areas identified at various Viking settlements sometimes contain artifacts suggesting cooperative activities, game boards with multiple playing pieces, collections of similar toys that would facilitate shared play, or practice craft materials arranged for group use. At Hedeby, archaeologists discovered what appears to be a children's secret hideaway, a small space between buildings containing collections of unusual objects. Pretty stones, bird feathers, a broken but colourful glass bead, and small carved figures. This collection, hidden from adult view, suggests children creating private social spaces with shared meaningful objects, evidence of peer bonds and collective imagination. How did Viking children process grief and loss, experiences that would have been common in a society with high mortality rates? Archaeological evidence suggests various coping mechanisms. Children's drawings and carvings sometimes depict deceased family members or pets, suggesting artistic expression as one pathway for processing loss. Small memorial markers created by children appear at some burial sites, simple stone arrangements or carved sticks placed near graves, distinct from formal adult memorials. The psychological impact of frequent death on Viking children must have been profound, yet the archaeological record suggests resilience rather than emotional devastation. Children's play continued in households that had experienced recent deaths. Children's craft activities resumed. Life moved forward. This resilience wasn't emotional callousness, but a necessary adaptation to a world where mortality was an expected part of experience rather than an exceptional tragedy. Toys and play objects provide particularly rich evidence of Viking children's emotional lives. Unlike modern mass-produced toys, Viking play items were typically created within the household, often by family members for specific children. This personal production imbued toys with emotional significance beyond their play function. They represented tangible expressions of adult care and attention. A particularly touching find from Birka includes a small wooden horse with a child's name carved into its side, found in a grave of a boy approximately 7 years old. The carving shows different tool marks than the horse itself, suggesting the child added their own mark to a toy made by an adult, a collaboration across generations preserved in a single object. Textile items in children's graves often show evidence of special care and emotional significance. At several sites, archaeologists have found children buried with small textile pouches containing collections of meaningful objects, pretty stones, unusual seeds, small wooden figures, fragments of imported goods. These collections, similar to the treasured objects many modern children gather, suggest continuity in how young people create personal meaning through special possessions. Comfort objects appear in the archaeological record in various forms. Small worn stones with smooth surfaces, possibly worry stones carried and handled frequently, appear in some children's graves. Soft textile items that may have served as comfort objects, small pillows or fabric bundles, occasionally survive in waterlogged or frozen contexts, showing evidence of extensive handling and repair. The transition to Christianity brought new dimensions to emotional expression within families. Archaeological evidence from the conversion period shows increasing numbers of family graves rather than individual burials, parents and children interred together, sometimes holding hands or in embracing positions. These arrangements, rare in earlier pagan contexts, suggest Christian influence created new ways of expressing family bonds that extended beyond death. How did Viking children understand their place within family emotional hierarchies? Archaeological evidence suggests considerable variation based on family status and regional practices. In some areas, child burials show careful attention and rich grave goods regardless of gender, suggesting relatively egalitarian emotional valuation of children. In other regions, clear differentiation appears between male and female children's burial treatment, suggesting gender-based differences in family position from early ages. The emotional significance of names and naming practices appears in both archaeological and textual sources. The common Viking practice of naming children after deceased relatives, particularly grandparents or recently deceased siblings, created emotional continuity across generations. Archaeological evidence of this practice includes family burial grounds where the same names reappear across generations, sometimes with small items passing from one namesake to the next. For children who lost parents, a common experience in the Viking world, archaeological evidence suggests various emotional adaptation strategies. Children's graves sometimes contain adults' personal items, suggesting the preservation of parental possessions as emotional connections to the deceased. Orphaned children's remains occasionally show evidence of adoption into new households, with grave goods reflecting both birth and adoptive family traditions, material evidence of emotional integration into new family units. The material culture of childhood emotion wasn't limited to responses to loss. Archaeological evidence also reveals celebrations, achievements, and moments of joy. Children's graves sometimes contain special items that appear to commemorate achievements. A boy's first successful hunt, represented by animal teeth fashioned into a necklace. A girl's first complete weaving project, included among her grave goods. These items suggest recognition and celebration of childhood accomplishments. Seasonal celebrations created emotional highlights in the Viking child's year. Archaeological evidence from midwinter festival sites includes children's toys, game pieces, and special food remains, suggesting Yule celebrations included specific attention to children's enjoyment. Similar evidence appears at sites associated with spring and harvest festivals, indicating children's emotional lives were enriched by regular communal celebrations. The emotional texture of daily life for Viking children included not just family relationships, but connections to animals. Children's graves occasionally contain remains of pets or favourite animals, small dogs, birds, or even mice, buried alongside their young owners. These finds suggest emotional bonds with animals provided additional attachment relationships for Viking children, perhaps especially important in households where adult attention was limited by work demands. What emotions might have accompanied the transition from childhood to adulthood? Archaeological evidence suggests mixed experiences. Some adolescent burials show evidence of celebration and achievement. New adult clothing, symbols of status, weapons or tools indicating new roles. Others reveal interrupted transitions, adolescents buried with a mixture of childhood and adult items, suggesting death during the liminal period between social categories. For girls approaching marriage age, archaeological evidence indicates complex emotional preparation. Young women's graves sometimes contain collections of household management tools, keys, textile implements, cooking tools, assembled before marriage, suggesting anticipation and preparation for adult roles. The quality and completeness of these collections may reflect emotional investment in the upcoming transition to wife and household manager. For boys approaching warrior status, weapon burials suggest similar emotional preparation for adult roles. Practice weapons give way to real ones. Training shields are replaced by battle-ready equipment. The careful arrangement of these items in adolescent male graves suggests pride and identity investment in the warrior role, even for those who died before fully achieving it. The emotional lives of thrall children remain more difficult to reconstruct archaeologically, as their burials typically contain few personal items. However, occasional finds suggest emotional bonds transcended even the brutal institution of slavery. At several sites, thrall children's remains show evidence of medical care for injuries or illnesses, setting of broken bones, treatment of infections, indicating someone invested care in children who had economic value, but perhaps also emotional significance. For all Viking children, regardless of status, play provided essential emotional outlets and processing mechanisms. Archaeological evidence of play is abundant across Viking contexts: board games, physical games, leaving marks on packed earth floors, imaginative play suggested by collections of figurines and props. These activities weren't mere time fillers, but crucial components of emotional development and stress management in a challenging environment. Would modern children recognise the emotional landscape of their Viking counterparts? In many ways, yes. The fundamental attachments to parents and siblings, the importance of play and friendship, the need for comfort during distress. Yet the emotional context differed dramatically. Viking children navigated a world where death was omnipresent, where physical hardship was expected, where emotional stoicism was valued alongside deep attachment. The archaeological record reveals Viking childhood as emotionally rich despite its material harshness. A world where strong bonds formed in challenging conditions, where children were valued despite their vulnerability, where families created meaning and connection even in the face of frequent loss. This emotional resilience, visible in the careful burial of a child with treasured possessions or the painstaking repair of a beloved toy, perhaps represents the most important legacy of Viking childhood: the capacity to form deep attachments in a world that offered little certainty beyond the present moment. As we conclude our exploration of Viking childhood, we might ask ourselves, what can we learn from these children who grew up in circumstances so different from our own? What wisdom might they offer about resilience, purpose, and human connection that remains relevant across the centuries? The wind still howls outside a reconstructed longhouse at Borg in the Lofoten Islands. Inside, modern visitors gather around a central hearth, listening as a guide describes daily life in the Viking Age. Many eyes widen when the conversation turns to children, their work responsibilities, their training, the dangers they faced from earliest infancy. Would any of you have survived a Viking childhood? The guide asks with a knowing smile. The question hangs in the air, uncomfortable yet compelling. As we conclude our journey through the harsh realities of Viking childhood, this question deserves our serious consideration. Would you, with your modern expectations, your physical conditioning, your psychological framework, have survived the gauntlet of challenges that faced every Norse child from the moment of birth, the odds were stacked against survival from the very beginning. Approximately 30% of Viking children died before reaching their first birthday, victims of malnutrition, disease, harsh weather, or simple bad luck. Those who survived infancy faced years of physical hardship, early work responsibilities, and constant exposure to dangers that modern parents would consider unthinkable for children. By age 5, you would have been carrying water, gathering firewood, and helping with livestock, not as chores, but as essential contributions to family survival. By 8, you would have been proficient in gender-specific skills, boys learning hunting, fishing, and basic weapon use, girls mastering textile production, food preservation, and household management. By 12, boys might join their first raids while girls prepared for marriage and household leadership. Childhood, as we understand it today, was compressed into a brief period before economic necessity demanded adult contributions. The physical evidence tells the story clearly. Viking children's skeletons show early development of muscle attachments where repetitive work strained growing bodies. Their teeth reveal periodic malnutrition through growth interruption lines. Their bones sometimes show healed fractures and injuries sustained during work or training. These children lived in bodies shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Yet focusing only on hardship misses the remarkable adaptations that allowed Viking children not merely to survive, but often to thrive in their challenging environment. Archaeological evidence reveals children who developed extraordinary physical capabilities, practical skills, and psychological resilience through their daily experiences. The Viking child who reached adulthood had already overcome challenges that would defeat many modern adults. What might we learn from these children of the past? Perhaps their most valuable lesson lies in the relationship between purpose and resilience. Viking children understood their essential role in family survival from earliest awareness. Their work wasn't arbitrary, but necessary. Their training wasn't abstract, but practical preparation for real challenges. This sense of purpose, of being needed rather than merely cherished, may have provided psychological resources for navigating hardship. Modern research in developmental psychology suggests that children develop resilience not through protection from all difficulties, but through successfully overcoming appropriate challenges with adequate support. Viking children certainly faced challenges, sometimes beyond what we would consider appropriate. But they also received clear cultural frameworks for understanding these challenges and recognition when they succeeded in meeting them. The material culture of Viking childhood reflects this balance of challenge and support. Children's tools were real, but sized appropriately for small hands. Training weapons were functional, but designed to minimize serious injury. Play items doubled as skill-building tools. Through this material environment, children received the message that they were expected to contribute, but also that adults recognized their developmental limitations. Family relationships, though differently expressed than in modern contexts, provided crucial emotional foundations for Viking children's resilience. Archaeological evidence of carefully repaired toys, lovingly crafted children's clothing, and tenderly arranged burials suggests that, despite harsh living conditions and high mortality rates, Viking parents formed deep attachments to their children. These bonds provided security from which children could explore their challenging world. The communal nature of Viking childhood may have offered another source of resilience. Unlike many modern children who interact primarily with age mates in school settings, Viking children participated in multi-age, multi-generational community activities. Archaeological evidence from work areas and living spaces shows children of various ages working alongside adults, learning through observation and gradually increasing participation rather than formal instruction separated from practical application. This integration into adult activities provided Viking children with numerous attachment figures beyond their parents, older siblings, extended family members, and other adults in the community who could offer guidance, comfort, and alternative models for navigating challenges. The archaeological record suggests these multiple relationships created safety nets for children who lost parents or experienced other disruptions. The stories Viking children absorbed, myths, sagas, and family histories provided another psychological resource. These narratives offered frameworks for understanding hardship as meaningful rather than merely painful. When a Viking child heard tales of gods and heroes overcoming tremendous obstacles, they received cultural tools for contextualizing their own struggles within a larger meaningful pattern. Would modern children benefit from some elements of Viking childhood without the extreme hardships? Perhaps. The sense of genuine contribution to family welfare, the integration into meaningful work alongside adults, the clear pathways toward valued social roles. These aspects of Viking childhood might address certain gaps in modern children's experience without returning to the brutal physical conditions of the past. What would a Viking child think of modern childhood? They might marvel at our material abundance, our medical capabilities, our educational resources, but they might also question our extended childhood dependency, our separation of children from meaningful production, our replacement of practical skill development with abstract learning disconnected from survival needs. This is not to romanticise the harsh realities of Viking childhood or suggest we should return to such demanding conditions. The archaeological record clearly shows the physical toll of early work, the casualties of inadequate medical knowledge, the children lost to conditions we can now easily prevent or treat. No reasonable person would wish to resurrect these aspects of the past. Yet as we cocoon modern children in layers of safety, convenience and extended dependency, the Viking child might ask whether we've lost something valuable, along with the hardships we've eliminated. Have we inadvertently deprived children of the sense of purpose, the community integration, and the clear pathways to valued social roles that helped their Viking counterparts navigate an unforgiving world? As you reflect on your journey through Viking childhood, consider what elements might enrich your understanding of human development across time. Perhaps the most valuable insight is simply recognition of children's capability and resilience, their ability to adapt to the circumstances of their time and place, while maintaining the fundamental human needs for attachment, meaning and belonging that transcend historical periods. The archaeological record of Viking childhood offers this powerful reminder. Children are not merely vulnerable beings requiring protection, but also remarkably adaptive individuals capable of meeting the challenges their society presents. The specific challenges change across time and culture, but the human capacity for growth through meaningful challenges remains constant. Would you have survived a Viking childhood? Perhaps not. The odds were against even those born into that world and raised with its expectations and skills. But in considering the question, you might discover something valuable about human adaptability, about the relationship between challenge and development, about the enduring needs that connect children across the centuries, despite vastly different material circumstances. If you found this exploration of Viking childhood illuminating, there's much more to discover about how children lived, learned and developed in different historical contexts. Each culture and time period offers unique insights into the interplay between biology and environment in human development, insights that might inform our understanding of childhood in our own time. Subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the lives of children throughout history, from ancient Egyptian royal offspring to medieval apprentices, from Renaissance court children to young factory workers of the Industrial Revolution. Each exploration offers new perspectives on what childhood has been, what it is now, and what it might become in the future. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of Viking childhood you found most surprising, or which elements you think might benefit modern children if adapted to contemporary circumstances. Your insights contribute to our collective understanding of childhood across time and culture. Like this video, if you've gained new appreciation for the resilience of children in harsh circumstances, or if you're curious to learn more about how different societies have approached the universal challenge of raising the next generation. Share this exploration with others interested in Viking history, childhood development, or archaeological approaches to understanding daily life in the past. Each sharing expands our collective conversation about what children need to thrive and how those needs have been met in different historical contexts. The children of the Viking Age have long since grown, aged and joined their ancestors. Their bones rest in the earth, their possessions lie in museum collections, their stories echo in sagas and archaeological reports. But in exploring their lives, we connect with the enduring human experience of childhood, the universal journey from vulnerability to capability that each generation navigates in the context of its time. And thank you for joining this journey into one of history's most challenging childhoods. Until our next historical exploration, remember that children have always been both more vulnerable and more capable than we might imagine, a paradox that continues to shape human development across time and culture.